Hey guys, what's going on? ZeroArmada here, Road to God Mode, episode 10. Still level 16, working on that grind. For this particular episode, we're going to be talking about aiming. How to aim, how to get better at aiming, some little tips and tricks, little settings that you can kind of change to help you with aiming as well. And kind of overall, how to make it so that you win that one firefight that you keep, losing, or that you lose by a little margin of error, I guess, so to speak. So a couple things. First off, we're going to kind of talk about some settings that can help out. Of course, visually, turn off the blur, turn off the depth of field, turn off the bloom. All that stuff was kind of, eye noise. It kind of really hinders when you're aiming down sight specifically. Especially the depth of field kind of makes it all blurry long range. Blur is kind of an obvious as well. So those settings will definitely help out in that regard. In terms of actual control settings, I have tight aim toggle disabled. And basically, what that does is when you ADS, you don't have to click to ADS and then click out to get out of ADS. You just click and hold. And I think ultimately, this is kind of more of a preference, but you want to mess around with this tight aim toggle setting to see which one you prefer better. Because I think ultimately that setting can kind of get you in and out of ADS faster, depending on what you prefer. And I think if I have it disabled, for me personally, it's a lot easier, a lot faster to get in ADS and do what I need to do than get out of it quickly. And that's just from a personal standpoint as well. Recoil reset, this is kind of a bugaboo. People prefer it both disabled or enabled. It kind of, ultimately, I think it depends on the gun. Some guns, it works out really well having recoil reset disabled. If you're rocking like a AR, for instance, or maybe a heavy assault rifle, I would prefer it being disabled. Maybe something like an SMG with lower recoil where it's not really that evident but still may help you out. That might be something you want to try experimenting with recoil reset enabled, but that's kind of another preference thing where you just have to kind of put it in game and try it out. I think it's better off disabled though. Crosshair settings, another thing we can kind of talk about real quickly. That's more of a preference as well. I definitely think the smart reticle, which is basically a big circle crosshair, that's kind of in the way. So I usually put that. I still have it on. I have like on 1 to 2 opacity, so you can still kind of see it, but it's relatively off. Kind of went with a 4-prong traditional crosshair. I prefer a small crosshair because it's better to aim off of. You don't really want this huge, gigantic crosshair that takes up most of your room. And I prefer it static as well. I think static is a little bit better aiming, and static basically makes it so that when you shoot, the crosshair doesn't expand based off of the recoil, if that makes sense. So that's kind of it for the settings part. Kind of more in depth in terms of aiming in game. Really, the thing with aiming is either you're on or you're off. Either you're kind of in the groove, you're really good at aiming right now, or you're off. It's more of those things that you can't. That's one of those random things you can't really control as much as the other things you can control, if that makes sense. So for instance, you can control where you're at in game, where you're positioned. It's mostly positioning, trying to get everything else in a way where you can make up for the lack of aiming, because most people, to be honest, aiming is like the most inconsistent thing you have when you're playing Blacklight or you're playing any other FPS game. So it's best to minimize all the other mistakes that you can possibly make, so that aiming's kind of the one thing that's a little bit random. Because not only is your aiming random, but most of the guns, the recoil and the spray is randomized to some extent. So you're still gonna have to, lotto shot for the most part when you're playing Blacklight anyways. So really, it comes down to positioning. It comes down to having a good aim down sight, or a good vision where you can see the enemy clearly but they can't see you, and that's kind of a given. I've kind of re-emphasized that many times. Mostly positioning's where you really want to focus, and I think the aiming will come in place. If you kind of I think the best way for me is I visualize like a vertical or horizontal line, like a horizontal line where people's heads are going to be at based on where I'm at on a map. So if you visualize that line and you kind of aim your crosshair accordingly, that's kind of a good way to line up your shots. Kind of predict where people are going to be coming out from maps and areas. You have HRV, of course, that's a vital tool, and you can kind of use that in tandem with your map knowledge to see, okay, if I put my crosshair here, when this guy pops up, he's going to be right in the crosshair. His head's going to be right on the crosshair. So you kind of want to learn how to pre-peek angles. You kind of want to learn how to, you know, lead targets and kind of set them up for failure. I guess is the best way of putting it. And another thing I kind of forgot to talk about real quickly when I was going over the settings was sensitivity. So there's a lot of different, you know, ideas about sensitivity, what you should have your sensitivity, what you have your mouse DPI on, blah blah blah. Ultimately, for FPS games, you want low sensitivity. Because when you aim, mostly if you're doing high sensitivity, you don't use your full arm. You usually use your wrist. With lower sensitivities, you actually have to kind of learn how to use your whole entire arm to kind of, you know, move a large amount of distance when you're kind of, you know, doing like a 360 or a 180 or you're turning around or something like that. So when you use your whole arm, you're going to have a lot more precision instead of just using your wrist, because your wrist is kind of, it's not really that much stability, if that makes sense. But I had like this whole video where I talked about mices and mouse, like what the perfect mouse is, what DPI you should use and all that stuff. So I'll link that down in the description box down below. But ideally you want 400 DPI. Honestly, anything above that's a gimmick. Unless you're doing anything over 1080p, you don't need any more DPI than about 400 to 1000. So keep that in mind. You want a good mouse pad as well for traction. Ideally, flawless mouse. You don't want any hardware, you know, software acceleration on your mouse, because you want to have like a one-to-one binding on your mouse, so that you know for sure that there's no uncertainty on your mouse. And like I said, mostly comes down to practice and comes down to removing all the different, you know, things that kind of make your aiming random or sporadic. So that's another thing that kind of helps out as well. But that's pretty much it for this commentary. Hopefully it helped out. Questions or comments down below as always, and thanks for watching. Much appreciated.